Hey everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show, and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Well, so sometimes, as a joke, I ask people how their dystopia is going, and this week, that became less funny. So, I hope you guys are doing okay, whether you are underwater or living in a Christian fascist area of the country. Oh boy. You know what though? I will tell you what is buoying my spirits, and that is today's episode, which is wonderful because I talked to the fantastic Ramona Gonzalez. If you don't know who Ramona is, why don't I read you her bio right now. Born in Oakland and raised in Berkeley, musician Ramona Gonzalez, aka Nite, studied philosophy at Occidental College. She remained involved in music throughout her studies, playing in a series of rock bands with her then-husband, and eventually starting her solo career as Nite. After a self-released 6-song CD-R titled My CD, which caught the ear of New York's taste-making Other Records, Nite issued the full-length Good Evening through Human Ear Music. Since then, Ramona has released over a dozen albums, EPs, and singles on record labels like Mexican Summer and Secretly Canadian, and her most recent album, No Sun, was released just last week on her own label, Gloriette, and I gotta tell you, it's great. This one was exciting for me on a number of levels. I've liked Ramona's music for, 9 years now. But more than that, I was really excited to talk to someone else who had studied philosophy at an academic level and who went on to study something else, or, because academia looms large in my own past, it's always interesting for me to speak to other people who maybe have made different decisions than I have made. Or maybe I'm asking them, was I crazy? Was I wrong about academia? I would say the answer almost always is no. Maybe you didn't go about leaving in the best way, burning bridges and such, but you weren't crazy. Anyway, this is just great. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you so much for checking out the show. What I like to do here at the very beginning is a little recommended if you like. If you like my talk with Ramona, maybe you will like my talk with other musicians that have been on the show. Recently, I talked to Terry Riley, basically the founder of minimalism composition. I talked to Lou Barlow from Sebadoh. That was great. Isabel Campbell from Bell and Sebastian. Clay Tarver and Matt Sweeney of Chavez and many other things. Mary Timoney, I talked to her recently. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to the show on wherever you get your podcast from, whatever podcatcher you choose. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. Got some great episodes coming up. Episode 500 in 2 weeks. That was exciting. I just talked to David Thomas of Pure Ubu, Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, Keith, a.k.a. Keith Knight, the cartoonist, and also the creator of the Hulu show Woke. That was a really good talk, so stay tuned for those. But for now, a quick note about sound. Ramona's recorder screwed up, so the first couple minutes are from the Zoom, so it's kind of low quality, and then it gets better right after that. So just wanted to let you know, in case you're like one of those soundophiles. All right, now let's talk to Ramona. I really want to talk to you a lot about academia. I'm a former academic. I used to be in a philosophy PhD program.
Oh, I was a philosophy undergrad.
Yeah. And I love philosophy. I mean, at least the philosophy that I was interested in.
So do I.
I'm not sure like what tradition you studied or had to study or wanted to study, but I was forced to do analytic philosophy for a lot of my academic career until I found out that there were other kinds of philosophy you could do, or there were other traditions. And then I was like, oh, wait, why aren't we all doing this other thing? But I'm kind of curious about like your own
I mean,
career.
it's been a long time since I studied philosophy. So undergrad for me, I graduated in 2009. I studied philosophy at Barnard too, but I was also interested in music. I took a musicology class from George Lewis there, which was kind of like a really formative experience. I actually didn't know it was musicology that I was taking. I just knew I was in a really, really interesting music class that was kind of philosophical. And I was like, damn, how can I get more classes like this? But I was also studying a lot of continental German philosophers. When I went to Occidental, I studied a variety of things, but mostly I was doing philosophy of art and aesthetics. And
that's what I did.
Oh, nice. So yeah, I did my thesis, undergraduate thesis was called An Ontology of Mass Art. And it compared one continental philosopher and one analytic philosopher's perspectives on the matter, or what I thought were their perspectives on the matter, and sort of like the history and what I thought. And, you know, it was really cool. But ultimately, at the end of 2009, I had already been kind of touring, but at the end of 2009, I had a European tour booked for about 7 weeks. And I'm like, well, there's no way I'm applying to grad school with this tour ahead of me, and I should just nurture my music career. Flash forward like 10 years later, and I still wasn't in grad school. I mean, I was dreaming of going to grad school, but the problem with philosophy is that if you're not fluent in German by the time you're 22 and you're not already in a philosophy PhD and you're behind, it can feel like you're really, really, really behind. So I was entertaining the idea of like, you know, maybe going to some master's program in philosophy or something that was interdisciplinary, or an aesthetics program in Europe. And, you know, I just felt like I wasn't there. I had been a dumb indie musician for 10 years. I met with a professor from Occidental who sadly passed now. He was also a composer, Bruno Luschwarn, and met with him around the time that I was touring my album Liquid Cool. We had coffee, and I was talking about how sad I was that I wasn't studying anymore still. And I was telling him about my touring, and he was like, you know, you should look into this program at UCLA. It's in musicology, and they like performers. They love performers. That most of the people in the program are musicians. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, he's like, I went there and you should try it out. And I met with Mitchell Morris, who's an incredible scholar. And I had lunch with him at UCLA, and the rest is history. I'm like, oh, these are my people. Like, they study music from a philosophical perspective. That's basically what musicology is, you know?
Yeah. I found that I love philosophy, but I didn't love the bullshit of academia enough to keep studying philosophy. And it was always just this like kind of half measure. Like my parents wanted a doctor, and I wanted to make art, quote unquote art, you know, podcasting and making movies in Hollywood, if you want to call that art. But you know what I mean?
It counts.
But like, and so it was like this half measure in between. And I found that like you have to find some kind of job where you can put up with the bullshit enough to do the thing you want to do. And like in Hollywood, I can put up with I hate saying that phrase, but like in showbiz, I can put up with the bullshit enough to
better phrase, showbiz. You're like, not Hollywood. Yeah. I'll say showbiz.
I've not found a good phrase. For the thing that I do.
I think Hollywood is fine.
Yeah, I don't know. It feels.
I go full cheese ball when I'm talking about cheesy things. You know, just you know, go for it.
Yeah, but do you know what it feels like? It feels like I should be wearing a pair of sunglasses when I'm saying it, and I should
and
be
a fedora.
Like, yeah. I should be like, well, you know, here in Hollywood, when I'm sitting at a coffee shop, writing my screenplays.
Your outfit needs to meet your language. You know, sounds like you need to up your wardrobe. I know what you're saying, that there's a lot of BS in academia, but the thing is that there's more BS in philosophy academia than other kinds, I feel. You know, I think so. I think it's because there's so much grandiosity. I do have like a penchant for philosophy Twitter, and I follow a lot of philosophy scholars. And, you know, there is this need to be super, like iconic in philosophy, you know, because you're studying icons, thinker icons. in musicology, it's a much more humble discipline, and that's why I like it. It's really just, these are music lovers writing about things that they enjoy. They're not trying to be icons in their own right. They're really just trying to be scholars. And so it's a much quieter discipline, and that really suits me because I don't really see myself being, I joke that I want to be a public intellectual, but actually, I mean, I've lived somewhat publicly as an indie musician, and I'd like that my academic chapter to be more just like in quietude. Sounds nice to me,
Yeah. I think there were two things really for me besides the bullshit part, which was like the analytic philosophy is hegemonic here, and no matter what you wanted to do, you always had to in some way pay lip service to analytic philosophy. And then the other thing is what you said, where you're like, you're studying these icons and you want to be iconic, yet the job of philosophy, and especially in grad school, is to just, and especially when you have to pay lip service to analytic philosophy, is you find what's the discussion about Aristotle's Metaphysics Zeta, and you read all of the papers that someone wrote on whatever little topic there is, and then you go to the last one and you pick something in that paper that you want to write about, and all you're doing is adding on like some more bullshit to this like long history of bullshit literature that's now like 2,000 years and 5,000 papers removed from Aristotle, who didn't even write this shit. It was his notes. This is the stuff that drove me absolutely fucking nuts. It was the notes that his students put together, and also the original scrolls disintegrated in the 10th century, and now my job is somehow to say like, well, there's a truth about this, and here's what he really is saying. And that's the shit that like made me insane.
Well, there's a meme about this, it's like there's like a picture of like a guy in a bath with like a notebook, and it's like philosophy in the 17th century, and it's like I have an idea that I like thought of in the bath, and I'm going to turn it into a text, and then philosophy today, and it's like I've carved myself out like a tiny little niche that like doesn't matter. It's like there's memes about this. The thing that I feel is important about like Aristotle and studying him or using him, because I do talk about him a bit in my work, and I did take ancient philosophy, and I thought to myself, God, like, what are we reading and why? The importance of it is because it's created an ideology that we still subscribe to in many ways in certain areas of thought. And so the why do we think this way currently can be traced back to certain texts. I mean, there are still people who read the Bible and think about the Bible and utilize it to construct their worlds. And I think we use the ideologies of the past to construct our worlds now in ways that are just sort of tacit,
Sure.
So in musicology, I talk about women's voices and how ancient perceptions around women's voices have been carried through to the present. And it's a real big trans-historical leap to make, but there's record of people hearkening back to these texts, whether they're faithful to the original author or not, over and over and over again throughout history to, come up with treatises for their work, hundreds of years later. Anyways, I guess what I'm saying is like, I also found it a little bit harrowing to have a perspective in philosophy, considering the amount of literature that I had to read, the fluency in German, which to this day I've taken 4 years of German and I still can't really talk. It's so hard. And just like the sheer amount of catch-up that you need to do to say the tiniest little thing. And I thought to myself, I want to say a lot. Like, I want to say so much. And that's why music felt like a better avenue to say something. When I was like in my early 20s.
Yeah. Here's the thing, too. If the analytic discourse and the analytic pedagogy was about, hey, this is Aristotle, and this is how we trace Aristotle's thought, even if it may not be the thing he exactly said, here's how the discourse has developed, and here's the kind of Hegelian, like in this kind of Hegelian tradition, right? Let's trace this thought out through history. If that's what it had been about, I would agree with you, but that it was about finding inconsistencies and trying to smooth them over. And when when you don't know whether the inconsistencies are in his thinking or in the fact that like there are 10 canonical copies of those original scrolls which disintegrated thousands of years ago, and there are copying errors between those 10 canonical copies, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't know why I'm wasting my life. I literally saw this. I envisioned my brain through this is way before I was in therapy, but my brain threw this image into my head. I was like maybe my third year of grad school, and it threw the image in my head as I was starting to do all the shit I needed to do to be ABD. Me sliding, like literally this vision in my head, sliding down a hill into an open grave. And you gotta, like, when your brain sends you those kind of images, you gotta listen to them in some way, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I was like, I grew up thinking big thoughts. I can like trace back to being a little kid and being like, I was like straight up like quoting Leibniz when I was like 5 years old. I feel like I was, and I was just like, really interested in philosophy, really interested in concept creation. I was like reading Nietzsche when I was like 15 because this like teacher at my huge public high school was like, you're a little weird. Here, I'm going to give you on the genealogy of morals. I was obsessed with philosophy. I was totally obsessed with it. But the reality of it as a scholar of philosophy today is very different than someone who just wants to kind of like pass the time thinking about these things. And it's funny because, I mean, it's a little bit taboo to say, but the scholar that I did study in my undergrad was primarily I studied Heidegger, who is a big no-no nowadays.
Which is a bummer.
It's a bummer. These texts were very important to me at the time. And there are certain essays that still play a role in like how I think about art. And I think that's fine. I'm not taking his whole philosophy, just without any sort of like critical eye to it. I realize who this person is. I date the text based on like what point in history of his, his life. I'm not reading, what is metaphysics and taking it like to heart, because that was just an insane speech. But anyways, so I'm studying Heidegger, I'm reading all these texts like back and forth in undergrad. I'm just like trying to figure it out, and it's kind of fun. It's like reading Kant. You're like, what is going on? Anyways, so flash forward to me in musicology now. So this was like maybe the first year of my program. So that was 2 years ago. And we're talking about some topic, and I'm like, we're talking about academia specifically. And in the Age of the World Picture essay, Heidegger talks about academics and specialization and the specialization of the disciplines. I remembered this from that essay. And I said in the meeting, I was like, you know what? I have a really good quote about this from Heidegger. I'm going to go home and I'm going to grab it and bring it to seminar next week. I hadn't opened this book in a while, so I go back, open the book, and I'm like, there is nowhere that this says what I think it says. It's complete nonsense. It makes no sense. In order to bring this quote into class, I would have to define like 50 terms, which themselves require reading an essay or reading a chapter. And I'm just like, it's not what he said. It's how I took it and how that informed my thinking and how I reinvented it and use it now in my life to think about art differently. It's not about faithfulness to Heidegger or being a Heidegger stan, which I'm not. It's just about words, prose inspiring you to think about the world differently, even if you don't even agree with the prose itself or even understand it, for that matter.
So what's stopping you from being a Heidegger stan? Is it that he slept with his students or that he was a Nazi? Which is the bigger thing that...
Well, it actually, I actually have to say that I held out for a long time. I am half Jewish, so I'm not just like a total, like, going along with this anti-Semitism. I really do find it problematic, obviously. But I felt so strongly about the poetic nature of his work, and I just loved the way he said things. the technology essay was super important for me. Anyways, I was listening to... I follow this scholar, Liam Kofi-Bright, who works in the UK. And he does logical positivism.
Uh-huh.
And the way that he describes Carnap and the logical positivist critique of Heidegger and what the dangers of that kind of philosophy, obscurantist philosophy, mean politically, that's kind of when I was like, yeah. It's sort of like, I got really into Wittgenstein too in undergrad. And so there's a part of me, there's like half of me that believes that things should be clear and that lack of clarity obscures some sort of like pernicious aim. You know what I'm saying? So, but then I also love poetry. So I'm like kind of like I waver between these two poles, but I do see what Liam is saying. You know, there is a sense in which at a certain point in Heidegger's philosophy it becomes very clear that his language is being used to obscure ideology. And that's when you kind of have to stop and say like, okay, that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, look, I really wish that I had gone to school at a time where people had been a little more woke and were going to teach, instead of like, I was taught by people who were like so obsessed with Heidegger. I mean, I really find value in a lot of Heidegger's language and the way that he describes things. I really wish, though, he had been taught in context and been like, he's a Nazi. Here's how the anti-Semitism comes out in his work.
Yeah.
And the thing is, though, it wasn't. But at the same time, I find it to be, I find like the critique coming from like analytic philosophers, from anyone like logical positivists or anywhere in that area to be unsubstantial. Because they only get to do their thing because they drummed out. I mean, I don't know about England is a different tradition, but in America, analytic philosophers only got to do what they wanted to do because they were McCarthyites and they kicked out anyone doing any kind of political philosophy.
Right.
So,
which is very different than overseas. I guess what I'm learning from Liam is that these logical positivists were, Marxists essentially, and I'm highly political, especially Carnap. And I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of this. I've just been like reading his work and Liam's work and listening to these various podcasts and stuff. And so that's where I'm coming from. It's kind of like a superficial knowledge. I actually had the opposite experience where, well, at Columbia there was Heidegger people, but at Occidental, my main like professor hated Heidegger. Everybody in my department hated Heidegger. They were all super anti. The guy who taught me Wittgenstein and epistemology had written several articles about how Heidegger's language obscures anti-Semitism. So I was like coming from a place where nobody wanted to read what I had to write about this. And they thought that I was being like, duped by this philosopher. So I really was like carving my own path. They didn't have an aesthetics program at Occidental. They didn't have anybody teaching philosophy of art. It was like I was doing a dissertation just like on my own, basically as an undergraduate. And because I was older, I had taken like 3 years off of school. I was just doing self-directed study. So I really was studying Heidegger under the framework of like, this guy isn't worth studying. And maybe that's why I tried so hard, is because I was like trying to convince them that it was worthwhile in some way. The paper that I did was comparing his perspective on popular art to an analytic philosopher in America. And that's just an easy takedown. It's just an easy takedown. You know what I mean? So I know what you mean. Analytic philosophy in America is extremely limiting. And, I didn't know the thing about McCarthyism, but that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. There's a great book by an UCLA professor, actually. Who teaches he might be the chair of I don't know what he is now. But he's in the German department. Again, because all of these, it's called Time in a Ditch, and it's about how philosophy in America only became this kind of quote unquote apolitical, because it really isn't. This is the stuff that drove me nuts in grad school, which is like, there's this kind, like when you say you're apolitical, what you're really masking is that you are for whatever the status quo is. And the status quo is always going to be this kind of like reactive, conservative kind of point of view. And I was going to grad school in the Bush years during a second term. And so it drove me absolutely fucking insane that you're telling me that what you're doing is apolitical when really you are just a front for whatever the hegemonic political power is at the moment. But yeah, so Time in a Ditch is basically about how, like, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, anyone who's did any kind of philosophy that had even like the like slight smell of having anything political attached to it got kicked out of their department, and then they went and populated English departments and populated film departments when those became, when that became a thing you could study. And so you have that kind of philosophy happening outside of philosophy departments and not being acknowledged by the, mainstream philosophers.
Mm-hmm. And, part of what I wrote about was, this philosopher, who shall not be named just because I don't want to be a jerk, was talking about popular art, trying to define it through logical propositions. X is considered a mass artwork if and only if. Da, da, da.
Yeah.
And what I said with Heidegger, and this was an insight from one of my professors at the time who hated Heidegger, but he had to admit, Heidegger is saying that, like, by defining something through a proposition, you're limiting the horizon of what's possible for an object. And that in itself is political, ethical, and in every way, And I thought, well, that seems obvious to me. And that's exactly what Heidegger is talking about, is that not only do logical propositions limit the horizon of what's possible for objects, the world limits our actions, the way we comport ourselves towards objects limits them and limits us.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I really, it's true. And that's the other thing. I was in a philosophy of film class, and I would name the guy, but I can't remember his name. But every week we would have a new proposition. X is a film if and only if X is whatever.
You're kidding me. Oh my God.
And we would argue about, like,
waste of time.
Thank you. Is a photograph a film? Is Andy Warhol's 8-hour it's not a still, right? It's still filmed the Empire State Building or whatever it is, right? But the camera doesn't move, and it's just 8 hours of the
is
Empire
that a
State
film?
Building.
It's like,
is that a film? It's just like, who gives a shit? Again, this is this kind of like where, like, my brain was screaming at me like, you are going to die, and
I
this
can
is going to be your
imagine.
life.
And this is why I'm so happy that I'm actually lucky that I managed to have this tours offered to me right at the start of my graduation, because otherwise I might have, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have even bothered going into an analytic philosophy program. Maybe I would have just gone to Europe or something. But I found that kind of analysis infuriating and pointless. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I would have, I think it's kind of like funny to me right now that I'm having a conversation with somebody who studied philosophy as a PhD student, because I'm like just such a dilettante. This is something I studied in undergrad. I continue to like have an adoration and admiration for people who study it, but I don't know the half of what you did in that program. But what you're saying about the film analysis, that rings true to me. That is giving me PTSD. So I get it.
Is there some kind of portmanteau between PhD and PTSD? My brain's not working right now. But yeah, but it was that. Yeah. It was that kind of thing where it just felt like, why are we doing this? Please give me some. Like, you can tell. I just had a flashback where, like, you could tell whether I was engaged in a class or not by how much doodling was done in the margins of my notebooks. Sure. And that class was all doodle. It was. And that's how I'll describe classes from now on.
That's
was it
such
all
a
doodle
bummer.
or no doodle?
I had a great film course at Columbia, actually, which was taught by this woman, Professor Mackay, Catalin Mackay, Aesthetics and Ethics, and it was all about film. And we studied Stanley Cavell, and it was freaking awesome. And it was about the ethics of filmmaking and gender, and all that kind of stuff. So it can be taught well in America, people. It can.
Sure.
But it just sounds like, where did you study?
I went to Temple for grad school, which is like one of the top aesthetics.
Fancy. Wow. Dang, I am so glad I was going to apply there. That's so funny.
Yeah, because, so again, it's this kind of thing where if analytic philosophy is hegemonic, then everything you do has to point towards that, even if you don't want to do that stuff here in America, unless you find unless you're able to like cobble together a kind of dissertation committee that doesn't give a shit, and that doesn't give a shit about that. I don't mean doesn't give a shit, period. But like, you have to the chances for you to do something interesting are so low until you get tenure, and I was not willing to give away 20 years of my life or however long. Now, I mean, the job market, like I have friends that graduated with their PhDs. I left the program and they all graduated. One of them's an adjunct. One of them left.
Bummer.
One of them is a librarian, like a philosophy librarian.
That sounds cool, honestly.
It is cool. And another one is a professor. So like one of them got a professorship. They're all great scholars, by the way. They're all like,
of course,
top. Like,
of course. So it's like winning the lottery. You might as well try to become a famous musician or an NBA player. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's just like it's so difficult right now. I mean, I'm so lucky because I found myself in this program at Occidental. It's like incredible music department, and I'm teaching classes there, and it's just a dream. And I feel so lucky, but it's because I was trying to prove myself through most of my life. As a woman, my background, being Latina and coming from sort of, lower class background, working class. And I just wanted to be a philosopher and show all these white dudes what I was boss, That was like what I wanted to do. And eventually I realized like, girl, like, come on, your skills are in music. Your skills are in music. You've been doing it for 12 years. Once I just sort of like accepted who I was, then all of these like sort of teaching skills like just appeared in me. My ability to teach songwriting, my ability to teach audio production, music business, whatever. Like it's like they were just like this natural part of me that I can impart to these students. And I was like, oh, and also studying musicology. I'm like, I have a knack for this. I spent so much time trying to prove myself in philosophy, not that much time, but a good amount of time, that I was losing sight of like what I was actually good at, which is basically like studying music and singing and playing keyboards. You know what I mean? Like, I just wanted to avoid it. I wanted to be some sort of like ivory tower sort of like, white male scholar and speaking German fluently and reading all these texts front to back. And once I got rid of that silly, like, sort of fantasy that was probably just based in, what Nietzsche might call like, ressentiment or whatever, inferiority complex. I think I fell into what I was good at, and I feel really lucky to have like had the foresight or insight to do so.
Yeah, can we talk about that journey a little bit, because that resonates with me so much. It's a lot of what I went through coming from, I mean, it's not the same exactly, right? But, I look for these little kinds of things in the people I talk to, the same, like I grew up Jewish in a Christian area, right? And I, middle class, going into this like very bourgeois, upper middle class to elite world, right? And that kind of stuff. And so a lot of what you just said, like, just like I felt it in my chest. So you grew up in the Bay Area, right?
East Bay. So Oakland, Berkeley border, and then we moved to North Berkeley because the schools were better. This was at a time that the Bay was very cheap and mixed. My dad is Mexican American. His family's from Jalisco, and my mom is Jews from. Well, they're originally East Coast, but then they moved to LA. And my parents were just hippies, basically. Political, but very out there, very just sort of like working class, politically active, hippie, musically inclined parents. And so, yeah, I would say we were just kind of like a weird working class family up until a point. My parents separated and divorced when I was 6 or 7. But, you know, it wasn't like my mom was thinking about Ivy League colleges or anything of that matter whatsoever. My dad didn't finish college. My mom did finish college. She was a dancer. I mean, it was very, like, you know, whatever about academia. Everybody was an intellectual and like was reading and things like that. But the idea of studying philosophy at Columbia University was nowhere near the world that I grew up in.
Is your dad first generation?
So yeah, sort of. It's actually sort of an odd case because my father's family were like, my father's father was working in Chicago, was recruited there to work in the industry, then recruited to work on the railroad in California. He was living in Mexico, but he was illegal, obviously. This was at a time that, you know, people weren't building walls. They were taking people for cheap labor over to the United States.
Right.
The entire family moved there. My father's mother was pregnant at the time, and he was born shortly after they moved to California. So he is a legal immigrant, but the rest of the family was not, just by a hair. And they moved to Oakland, California, where my father's mother started a Mexican restaurant, and they were doing well there. You know, for about, I'd say, 8 years, maybe a little less, 6 or 7. At which point, you know, Eisenhower had implemented all these really intense rounding up sort of immigrants policies. People were telling on each other's neighbors, and I mean, it was just a really, really alarmist time. And my father's family got rounded up in 24 hours, was taken out of their home, and were taken on a bus to Nogales, Mexico, and that was it. And so my father was deported, even though he was legal, because what is he going to do? Be just some 6-year-old alone in Oakland? Is an incredibly traumatic experience. And he ended up coming back to the States with his older brother, who had a family that like advocated for him, a German family actually, in Oakland, who became his sponsor, that's what it's called, to work for them. So my dad could go back to school in the States and continue English and continue learning. Some of the family came back, and then some of the family stayed in Mexico, but it was just extremely, traumatic experience for the whole family. And so that's the long answer to the question, is my dad first generation? It's complicated.
Yeah. What happened to the restaurant? When this stuff happens, I mean, obviously, like, people are just like taken, and you know, I mean, in my mind, you know, then a wealthy white person just takes the land or something like that, right? Is what usually happens. I
actually don't know what happened to the restaurant. I know she started another restaurant briefly, but unfortunately, and I think she started another restaurant for a while in Oakland, and the father did not come back to the States, so she and the 4 kids were together. She had another restaurant. I don't know what happened to the first one. El Buen Gusto, that was the name of that restaurant. She actually ended up dying fairly young when the kids were still teenagers, I think, with stroke. You know, it's hard living this life undocumented in the U.S., especially at that time. It was harrowing experience, I can imagine, and raising 4 kids all by yourself. So, I don't know the ins and outs of those years, but I think it took her a while to get back to the States, honestly. It might have taken at least like 3 years for her to actually get back and start the restaurant again. So they were just 2 little, you know, sons living in the East Bay, just, you know, working and learning and trying their best. I mean, it was pretty crazy. It was a pretty crazy time for my father.
Yeah, I mean, I just had assumed that, like, pre-NAFTA, things were not as violent as they are now, or like pre-ICE, pre-Department of Homeland Security, that obviously it was not friendly, but I didn't realize it was it's just been the same violence. The same violence in the 50s is relatively the same violence now.
I don't know, like, the whole general experience of undocumented people during that time compared to now, but I will say that there was a stark shift from the period that Mexican immigrants were being recruited to work for United States industries to the point that Eisenhower implemented Operation Wetback. You know, it's like there was a point that the policy was decided that these people needed to go. And so in that sense, you know, policies can be made for whatever reason based on racism or whatever the whim of, you know, the executive order is. So in that sense, yes, there was definitely violence. Was there the Gestapo, like ICE back then? I'm not sure. I mean, I couldn't say for sure. All I know is that my father's experience has definitely informed how I view politics, where I do see that executive powers have the capacity to decide the future of their citizens. You know, we may just think they are a talking head, but an executive order can have a very, very big impact on, and whoever is in power can have a very big impact on local families. So, yeah, it's hard for me to say. That's just my personal experience that informs my thoughts on it.
Yeah. I mean, how else, like, did you know this growing up?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I didn't know the ins and outs of, like, the deportation, say. I knew that it happened, and I knew that people didn't like to talk about it, and I knew that the family was very splintered, and there was a lot of, like, grief, you know. But it was not something that my father talked about all the time. You know, he struggled a lot. And so I just knew that there was, like, struggle and trauma in this more sort of general sense. And I chalked that up to some sort of relationship to how the family was ejected at a certain point, you know? That's just got to be really tough on everybody. It was just like a very splintered, struggling unit of people. And I also never went back to Mexico until recently to see, like, the town that my family's from. You know, there was just, like, that's what happens to, you know, undocumented people who are splintered in this way through the trauma of deportation. Like, the roots disappear too.
Yeah.
You know, everything just sorts, all the family trees, the connections, the kinship. You know, these policies are made in order to destroy those kinship bonds. So it was just like the family wasn't really there. It's like, where is the family, you know? Whereas on my mom's side, the Jewish side, you know, there was always, you know, aunts reaching out to me, grandparents, you know, all this kind of stuff. And there was a stark difference between the two sides.
It's interesting, though, too, that whenever I talk to anyone who's like, if you're non-white or you're non-Christian, there is in some part of your past trauma. Like, no matter what I want to talk about, like, no matter what I want to say about myself.
I don't know why I'm laughing. Yeah.
No, but, well, it's a laugh of recognition. You're like, yep, I see that. Because, you know, the Holocaust always sits there. I was raised with it being a defining part of my existence. That, like, a couple decades before I was, not a couple, but, like, you know, 3 or 4 decades before I was born, someone tried to wipe us out. All right. And it just sits, it's like part of, you know, unless you're a WASP, you know, there's always this kind of, not just like, I want to say like feeling or emotion, but like just this kind of event that sits in your past that defines you, that you had nothing to do with. Right? Yeah.
It's an generalized existential suffering from like a lineage of trauma. And it's a shared experience between different cultures for sure. And there are like power differentials that exist even between those traumatized groups. You know, it's like, I'm never going to know the experience of a black person living in the United States, and a Jewish person is never going to know the experience of a Latino male growing up in the United States. You know, everybody has their different sort of lineages, but definitely there is a commonality also. And yeah, I mean, I have friends whose parents met at concentration camps, you know, and that's, they're neurotic people,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the result. They're freaking neurotic. And I think that my dad is very fatalistic. He makes jokes. He just makes he has extremely dark humor. And that's something that carries through. There are certain commonalities that carry through both sides of my family. I'd say that fatalistic sort of like dark humor is definitely found on both sides, but also the commitment to political activism. My mother and father met at a Cesar Chavez rally in Berkeley, and that was how they bonded, was through like wanting to cause a change. And that is something they shared through the history of political activism in their families, which has a lot to do with that lineage that you're talking about, I think.
Yeah. So when you're growing up, how do you think this affected you? I don't mean just the trauma, but I mean like both them being politically active. Did you grok? I don't know why that's the word that came to my mind, but did it penetrate your brain? Did you start to see? Because I didn't start to really understand injustice until I got out of the suburbs of Pennsylvania.
I was very aware of injustice, and I am an Aquarius. I'm just going to say that right now, just because it's funny, and I have an obsession with fairness.
Yeah.
But again, like how that spoke to me was because political activism in all its guises, both real and, superficial, were present in Berkeley, California at the time in the 90s. There were kids who were walking out of school so they could get a day off for a certain political rally, and there were kids who were actually dedicated to the cause, and I was seeing all of that. And my dedication to like ethics had more to do with philosophy. Yeah. So my idea was, what is justice? What is fairness? Why is the world this way? I couldn't believe how people were just obsessed with power. It was just like fascinating to me, and how certain people were victims of circumstance, and how that plays into the psychology of various people. So that was how it affected me. It wasn't like political activism was all over Berkeley to larger or lesser degrees. And that was all around me. And I was going to walkouts and protests all the time. But that was just par for the course. Mm-hmm. I think my parents' activism affected me more, and the trauma of my father's life affected me more, to try to understand how injustice could exist, So that's why I think philosophy drew me in at that time.
Yeah. So, I mean, you started reading philosophy, you said, at an early age.
Yeah, I feel like it was like 15 that I started reading Nietzsche texts. And I was pretty obsessed with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a high school. Nietzsche's specifically Genealogy of Morals is a very high school kind of.
So high school. Yeah. Thus spake Zarathustra. God, I can't roll off my tongue. Beyond Good and Evil. These were all things I was like reading at the time, and I wasn't really understanding it. So, because it's like I'm 15. But I'm like, yeah, this guy's angry and he's writing in fragments and he's like speaking to me, I thought I was like really cool. I would carry the book around with me. Whatever I understood from it, I think that like what I took from it was concepts of power.
Yeah.
And how that affects us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, once you read this stuff, I found my brain warped by philosophy. I mean, I read like Sartre in high school.
And Foucault. Yeah.
Okay.
And Sartre, a little bit of that too. And Camus. Like, but again, sure. I didn't understand it. It.
That's what I was just about to say.
I maybe understood Foucault just because it's more like, history, discipline and punish, Yeah. But I didn't understand the point. Like, I didn't know who these people were, what the time periods, like why they were writing. It was just, I just was reading them as if they like appeared out of nowhere. I didn't understand the context because I was a teenager. But yeah, I was a bit depressive and emo. So I wanted to, I wanted to get deep into these texts that spoke about the frameworks of power and things like that. That's the only way I can put it, because it's like, I don't want to get too deep into like what spoke to me at the time. I mean, I guess I could say when coming from like a difficult background as I did, and especially with my father's experience and the sort of dark spiral that he plunged into, I think Nietzsche was helpful for me to sort of embrace, he says something like, I think this is in The Gay Science or something, where he says something to the effect of, people are intelligent only insofar as they've experienced pain and suffering.
Yeah.
This is just what I needed to hear at the time. I just needed to hear that. Like, all those people out there praying to God and thinking everything's going to be good, and they're just freaking automatons. I mean, that's what I needed. That's what I needed at the time. I needed to think that all this suffering was going to pay off somehow, whether intellectually or something like that. It did well for me because it motivated me as a young person.
Yeah, I mean, look, I had this kind of like inchoate understanding of power, and I knew I just did not like authority, or I didn't like unjustified authority. Like, I think about, like, Chomsky talks about that a lot. It's like, power has to justify itself to you. Otherwise, why are you allowing them to tell you what to do? And it was a lot of, like, unjustified authority telling me what to do, and I was like, well, you didn't earn the right. It just seems like you're just telling me because you have this power, because you are able to. And I don't have to comply with it. If I didn't act out a lot. Like, I wasn't like skipping school or drinking or anything like that. But I would just, like, if someone told me to do something and I didn't think there was any value in it, I just wouldn't do it. And I would get in trouble for that kind of stuff.
I still get in trouble for that, to be honest. And I think that's so well put. Is unjustified authority is extremely troubling, and I think Foucault and Nietzsche put it in context. They're like, there's a historical reason why this is occurring, and I need to make sense of it, and just protesting it wasn't enough for me. I needed to know every in and out of, like, why this was going down, not just to, like, hold a sign and say outside of my high school and say, make it stop.
Right. I mean, that's what drew me to philosophy. Originally, I was going to be a physicist because, like, the big thing for me was, like,
I love physics too. Yeah. We're big nerds over here.
It's like, why is this world like the way it is? And so I read as much quantum physics and particle physics and as much about relativity and astrophysics as I could. And then I kind of, like, I got it. Like, I don't get the, like, obviously, not obviously, but, like, I've read Schrodinger's, papers. I don't understand them because it's all mathematics.
You're way beyond me. But I get the impulse to want to understand how the universe works. Yeah. And scientifically is one way to, I don't know, calm the mind, or, just be interested in the awesomeness of the universe.
Right.
My partner's an amateur astronomer, and we just set up the telescope and looked at Jupiter and Saturn the other night. And he's always talking about, how it would be very unlikely that there wasn't another one of us somewhere.
Sure.
And, that's just a really nice thought. I like to think big like that. I think what shifted over time is that, like I said, I had just this insane inferiority complex. And I wanted to combat that by, upward mobility. And I think what happened as I got older is that I learned to, instead of to embrace my existence, not just as a reaction to what I didn't have. Now I'm just interested in how does my, like, identity and psychology as this person, as one of a few marginalized communities, add to the thoughtfulness of conversation, as opposed to being like, how can I pretend I am not this? Mm-hmm. Or how can I be not this? I was just trying to, like, run away from myself for so long. And now I'm just, like, embracing what my position in the world adds to the conversation that maybe wouldn't happen if I hadn't been in this position. So that feels like a healthier mentality, and academia is really positioned to like accept that mentality now. Back when I was an undergrad, it was all about denying. Now it's like, oh, Ramona, as, a woman of color who grew up with this kind of background and is a performer, you have a lot to add to the conversation based on that information, based on who you are, and I'm like, oh my God, how novel, so it's like, I feel like that is like a lucky place that I'm in right now where academia is welcoming that. In the past, when I was an undergrad, or maybe when you were a PhD, it was really about denial of self for the most
100%.
part. Yeah, okay.
100%. I remember in undergrad, I wrote my undergraduate thesis, my first one, and I'll explain, you'll see in a moment why I say first one, on this guy, I forget his first name, McTaggart. He was like a Scottish philosopher.
Yeah.
And he wrote a paper that said time doesn't exist, right? And he gives some kind of logical argument for why time doesn't exist. And I wrote a paper, and the first part of the thesis, it was like 50-page thesis, something like that. The first part was like, why would someone say that? What's wrong with? I didn't say it like this in this plain way I'm saying right now, but it was basically asking like, what in his life made him believe that time doesn't exist, and here's this thing. And
Exactly.
I got a quote unquote gentleman's B on the thesis, and my advisor was like, this is ad hominem, you can't write this. And I'm like, but it doesn't make sense. Why would anyone?
It's not ad hominem when you're trying to understand the motivations of a scholar.
It doesn't matter. What you do in analytic philosophy is you take the person's argument and you find the holes in it, or you write something to support it in some way. And that's the job. And I was like, I can't go to grad school with a gentleman's B, so I had to find another advisor and write a second thesis. That was fine. Even though that thesis, again, I want to get back in just a second to you saying how you found yourself again, because the second thesis started with experimental writing. Like I was originally going to go to grad school for philosophy of experimental literature. And
nice, cool.
So I started writing with this little bit, and he was like, can you remove this? The rest of it's great. Just remove this little bit of thing. And he was great. That thesis advisor, the second one, Professor Brandom, he's very cool, but like even that was like too much. And I found that all this stuff, again, I like how you said it. It was a reaction. It was being reactionary. And I have a amateur theory on this show that in some way, when you embrace who you were as a child, you come into your own. When you stop reacting in some way, and obviously you can never like stop that reacting, but like when you can push through the fog of it, or when you can bring back in this kind of like Hegelian like Aufhebung, right, where the past can come back into your life in a realized way. And I'm kind of curious about how that happened for you. How did you?
Well, it's interesting because music has always been sort of like a return to origins. Every time I like get into a new rhythm with it, whether it's like a new record or a new time that I'm recording or singing or songwriting. Because when I was a kid, it was like, my parents were not helicopter parents in the least. It was the opposite. They were like, you do your own thing. So I was in my room a lot or by the piano a lot, doing imaginary play, just like thinking, making up worlds, things like that. So every time that I return to music as a discipline, if you could call it that, it's a return to that period where I have to get into this imaginary state. And I think with this current record, I think with my first record, it was very imaginary. And then with the subsequent record, there was a lot of imaginary play, but there was also a lot of calculation in terms of like songwriting and mechanisms and methodology with respect to songwriting and production, because you're getting your feet wet with how you want to professionalize your career. With this record in particular, it was really like written in a time and place where there was not a lot of possibility for me to do a lot of calculation. It was written in multiple stages where I was able to do some calculation before the major songwriting happened. So I got these particular synthesizers and I was all set up to improvise and do these particular things. But when my life started to dissolve in the middle of 2018 and I started to write the songs for this album, So I had all the instruments ready to go because I had already planned that, because I'm a bit of a planner. But once I was kicked out of my apartment and I was going from couch to couch at my friends' houses, and I was like effectively homeless, and I was just like in very dire emotional place. Sorry?
What happened?
Oh, sorry. Maybe my publicist didn't send you the press release, but my marriage dissolved. My 12-year marriage dissolved. It explains it in the press release, but I'll just tell you, I had a partner. It was my musical partner, my best friend, and in the summer of 2018, that all came to an end, very kind of calamitously. And so when I say I had set up all of my the production side of things, that was previous to the breakup. I was, just like, I had my synths ready to go. I had bought myself a sequencer. So once I was kicked out of my apartment, I was homeless, I still had this setup with me, right? And I brought it with me to all these places, because it's my safe place, like a therapist would say. So when I was writing the music for it, I would return to that sense, that like ancient sense of myself, where I would be just in a sort of fantasy world writing music. And it was very extreme at that point because I didn't have anything around me. I didn't have a studio. I didn't have my musical collaborator that I worked with all the time. I didn't even have a home. So it was like really becoming sort of in this very specific fantasy world that I had to create because it was so chaotic around me during that time that I was writing the music for this album. I think that was right at the beginning of my PhD program. The PhD program started in the fall of 2018. I think that experience, that extreme sort of shift, and having to really return to the places I went to as a child to keep my head on straight and to keep myself happy, essentially. I think I came to some sort of realization about like who I was at that time. I mean, how could you not,
well, you could repress it. you could run from it.
You're right. But I think music has just always been the place that I go to become myself.
Uh-huh.
And it was very, very pointed at that time because all I had was myself. I was completely alone. So,
I mean, this is total armchair psychology, but are there any resonances between your own parents' divorce and what you did in the wake of their divorce and for sure. I mean, kids create worlds like that because it's chaotic. It's funny, actually, the Leibniz me when I was a kid was, why is there something rather than nothing? I literally had that thought when I was young. I said, why is it not just me floating in blackness as a thought? Why are there bodies? Why are there these bodies around me? Why are there objects around me? And I always thought that was a sign that I was a genius or something. And I'm look at this. I thought the coolest things when I was 6 years old. And then, later when I started going to therapy, my therapist was like, sounds like you were going through a lot of trauma at the time. What do you think a kid would have to be going through for them to think something like that? And I was like, oh, so it doesn't mean I'm a genius? And they're like, no, I don't think so. And I was like, oh, damn, that was the narrative I had going all along. But yeah, I think that, all you have is your thoughts at that point and who and you and just this, you're in this universe, floating in space. And it's funny because the last song on the record is a Sun Ra cover called When There Is No Sun. And, that is very I'm realizing the connection just now, he's talking about outer space. He's talking about, pure blackness, where the sun is not shining, we only see the stars because the sun is hitting them, but what if the sun isn't hitting them? Where are we? It's a scary thought, but also space for Sun Ra is the world beyond where there's salvation and liberation as well. And so sometimes this scary, scary place that you create for yourself when you're being creative, when you're being imaginary, when all these messed up things are going on around you, it's a really, really intensely frightening place to be in a way. The vulnerability of it is really scary.
but it's also like the only way to liberate yourself from these things that are like holding you down, I guess, is maybe how I'd put it.
I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just have like one more question, and I'm kind of curious. Did you notice a change, both physiological or mental, and also creative in the way you wrote songs as you settled into yourself? Or do you think it was just, or it could not be? I'm saying this, I've noticed in myself that as I settled into myself, things change for me, and I don't want to like prejudice your possible answer.
No. I think it's a totally fair question. I think that there are some through lines that will always be the case with the way that I create, certain ways that I set up. You know, music is a process. There's different stages. It's kind of like writing a dissertation, you know. There's the reading, there's the note-taking, there's the outlining, there's the writing, the prose. Similar with music, you know, there's the setting up of the framework for the production of it. Because I'm not just singing with guitar, right? I'm producing it. So there's a lot of elements you have to set up. And also like the concept, you know. What is the concept? How is it going to be recorded? So that is all sort of in the history of how I normally do things. There's a lot of improvisation. There's a lot of use of like sequences and keyboards and things like that. But then this songwriting portion, which is the singing and lyric writing, which is the part that like is like, how do we do it all? You know? I'd say that was a little different this time. I'd say it was a little different. Something changed with that process where, and I don't really know what it is yet because I haven't had a chance to really reflect on and compare and contrast, but the way that I wrote the lyrics, the way that I sang, the way that the songs were written, that creative portion that's a little bit less systematic in the process of making an album. It's that little time. It's like my friends and I always talk about, my other friends who are musicians, it's like those moments where you sing, they last for like 5 minutes, you know, it's like these 5-minute bursts, like where you're singing and you're like, how is it happening? You know, I don't know what's different about it, but it's qualitatively different. I listen to it and I'm like, something is different in my voice, in the way that I'm singing, in the way that I'm talking. The words are different. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm sure I could evaluate it later and come up with some sort of musicological theory or something.
Let me throw this out at you. This was my own experience, and I wonder if it resonates at all. I found myself to be a bifurcated being, and that I was this kind of like analytic, and I don't mean like analytic philosophy, but like I was analyzing things, and I had this analytic mind, and I found it difficult to move modes. If I was analyzing something, I found it difficult to be whimsical or be comedic. And
right.
Then as I settled into myself, as I kind of stopped pushing against what people wanted from me, and that I realized who I was and I was going to let that out in a more full way, that though the bifurcation healed and I was able to move between modes in a more fluid way, and in a way now where I think I can move between them effortlessly.
It's the goal. It's the goal. It's the goal of not only my music, but my scholarship, you know. I mean, I study women's laments, women's music, women's vocality, and I want to include my own experience in there. And I want to include my free writing, my experimental writing on my thoughts, as well as my highly analytic, scholarly writing. You know, the goal is to weave those together to create a world. You know, some scholars do it effortlessly, you know, Anne Carson, Maggie Nelson, you know, they are aware of how those two sides of themselves are one. Maybe Susan Sontag a little bit too. But like, yeah, I've struggled with it my whole life. And it has to do with philosophy, right? Studying philosophy, they tell you, get rid of yourself. It's not about you. There is no I, you know? It's just like, give me a break, man. Like, I'm a person. So I think that I mean, and also it's not just philosophy. I wanted to just be analytic because I wanted to get away from myself. So philosophy was perfect for me. But I agree with you. I think that I'm trying very hard to collapse those sides of myself in the past 3 years. And, you know, you inch closer every time you make an effort, basically.
Yeah. Ramona, thank you so much.
Such a great convo. How lucky am I that I got to speak to a philosophy PhD? I get to revisit those topics. It was so awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.